While booking their flight to Costa Rica, my dad said loudly, "He owes us. After all we did raising him." My sister laughed. "He's just a wallet with legs." They didn't know I was in the room. I'd quietly paid off their $2,400 bills for years, without a thank you. So I sold the house they lived in, cleared the accounts, and vanished. I, 29M, thought I was being a good son. For 3 years, I'd been quietly covering my father's mounting bills while he and my sister lived in the house I'd inherited from our grandmother. The $2,400 monthly payments for their utilities, groceries, and credit cards felt manageable with my tech job salary. I never asked for thanks. Family helps family, right? That changed the moment I overheard them planning their Costa Rica vacation. I'd come home early from work to grab some documents from my old room when I heard voices from the kitchen. My father's voice carried through the hallway as he spoke into his phone, apparently booking flights. He sounded more animated than I'd heard him in years. My father told whoever was on the line that they wanted the premium package. Money was no object. Then he laughed and said something that made my blood freeze. He declared loudly that his son owed them after everything they'd done raising him. The person on the other end must have made some comment because my father chuckled again. My sister's laughter rang out next. She chimed in from across the room, calling me nothing more than a wallet with legs. Her tone was so casual, so dismissive, like they were discussing the weather. She added that I was good for at least covering this trip since I'd been paying for everything else anyway. My father agreed enthusiastically, saying I'd never had the spine to say no to them. He mentioned how easy it had been to get me to cover the bills without even asking directly. Just mentioning money troubles was enough to get me reaching for my checkbook. I stood frozen in the hallway, processing what I'd just heard. 3 years of sacrifice, 3 years of cutting back on my own expenses, 3 years of believing I was helping family who appreciated it. Instead, I was financing the lifestyle of 2 people who saw me as nothing more than an ATM. The conversation continued for another few minutes. They discussed restaurant recommendations and excursion packages, all funded by money they assumed would come from me. My sister mentioned that I probably wouldn't even notice the extra expenses on my credit cards. My father said something about me being too predictable to ever grow a backbone. I quietly backed out of the house and sat in my car for 20 minutes, letting their words sink in. The hurt gradually transformed into something else, a cold, calculating anger I'd never felt before. That evening, I acted normal when they brought up their vacation plans. My father mentioned they'd found a great deal on a Costa Rica package and asked if I could help with the expenses. My sister added that it would mean so much to them, especially after everything they'd been through recently. I smiled and told them I'd think about it. Over the next week, I began making calls. The house they lived in had been left to me in my grandmother's will, something they seemed to have conveniently forgotten. I'd never charged them rent, never asked for contributions to maintenance or property taxes. I'd simply let them live there while covering their expenses because I thought that's what family did. I contacted a real estate agent first. The house was worth significantly more than when I'd inherited it, and the market was hot. She assured me it would sell quickly if priced right. I also reached out to a property management company about temporary housing options for myself. Next, I visited my bank and credit card companies. Every automatic payment I'd set up for their bills got canceled. Every joint account where I covered their expenses got closed. I transferred all remaining funds to new accounts they couldn't access. The financial cleanup took longer than expected. I discovered they'd been charging more than I realized: subscription services, online shopping, restaurant deliveries. The monthly total was actually closer to $3,200, not the $2,400 I'd calculated. 3 years of that added up to a substantial sum. I hired movers for the weekend they'd planned to finalize their vacation booking. Professional movers packed my belongings while my father and sister were out shopping for travel gear with money they thought I'd provide. By Sunday evening, I'd moved into a furnished apartment across town. The house went on the market Monday morning with a 30-day closing timeline. I'd arranged everything with the real estate agent beforehand. The first call came Tuesday evening. My father sounded confused when he asked why his credit card had been declined at dinner. I told him there seemed to be some banking error and suggested he call customer service. He grumbled about incompetent bank employees but didn't press further. Wednesday brought more calls. My sister had discovered several of her subscription services were canceled. Her tone was more accusatory when she asked what was happening with the accounts. I maintained that I was looking into the banking issues and would sort everything out soon. Thursday, they realized something more serious was wrong. My father called me at work, his voice tight with anxiety. He'd spoken to the bank and learned that all the accounts he'd been relying on were closed. He demanded to know what I'd done. I told him calmly that I'd simply stopped paying bills that weren't mine. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the casual confidence I'd overheard the week before. My father asked if this was some kind of joke. He reminded me that they were family, that family takes care of each other. He said they'd always been there for me when I needed them. I let him finish before responding. I mentioned that I'd been taking care of family for 3 years without any acknowledgement or appreciation. I told him I'd overheard their conversation about Costa Rica, including their charming descriptions of me as a wallet with legs. The conversation deteriorated quickly after that. My father's tone shifted from confusion to anger to something approaching panic. He insisted they'd never said those things, that I'd misunderstood their meaning. When that approach failed, he tried guilt, reminding me of everything they'd done raising me. I ended the call by suggesting he contact the bank about payment plans for his bills. Friday brought the most interesting development. My sister showed up at my office building, somehow having tracked down where I worked. Security called to inform me I had a visitor who was becoming increasingly agitated in the lobby. I went downstairs to find my sister pacing near the elevators, her usual composed demeanor completely shattered. The moment she saw me, she launched into a verbal assault that drew stares from other people in the lobby. My sister accused me of abandoning family, of being vindictive and cruel. She said they depended on me, that I couldn't just cut them off without warning. She mentioned that they'd already paid deposits for their vacation and couldn't get refunds. I listened without interrupting, then suggested we continue the conversation outside. On the sidewalk, away from my colleagues, I explained exactly what I'd heard and how long I'd been covering their expenses without any gratitude. My sister's approach changed when shouting didn't work. She became tearful, apologetic, insisting they'd never meant to take advantage of me. She claimed they'd always appreciated my help, but hadn't known how to express it properly. She begged me to reconsider, to give them another chance. I told her that second chances required first acknowledgement of the problem, something that had taken them a week of canceled services to achieve. I also mentioned that I'd found additional charges they'd made without my knowledge, bringing their monthly expenses well over what I'd originally calculated. The weekend passed quietly. No calls, no visits, no attempts at reconciliation. I began to wonder if they'd accepted the new reality or were planning some other approach. Monday brought my answer. My father called to inform me that they'd consulted with a lawyer about their rights regarding the house. His tone had regained some of its earlier confidence. He suggested that I couldn't legally evict them without proper notice, and that family court might view my actions as elder abuse. I let him finish his legal threats before sharing some news of my own. I informed him that the house had sold over the weekend, with closing scheduled for 3 weeks out. As the legal owner, I had every right to sell the property. The new buyers were investors who planned to renovate before renting to new tenants. The silence that followed was even longer than our previous conversation. When my father finally spoke, his voice sounded older, defeated. He asked where they were supposed to go, what they were supposed to do. I suggested they use the same resourcefulness they'd planned to apply to their Costa Rica vacation. I also mentioned that 3 weeks gave them more notice than they'd given me before treating me like their personal bank account. Over the following days, other family members began calling. Apparently, my father and sister had reached out to cousins, aunts, and uncles, painting me as the villain in their version of events. Each caller started with some variation of the same theme. Family should stick together. I was being too harsh. Couldn't I find it in my heart to forgive? I listened politely to each lecture about family values and responsibility. Then I shared the real story. 3 years of anonymous financial support, the overheard conversation, the complete lack of gratitude or acknowledgement. I explained that I'd never asked them to leave or stopped supporting them abruptly. I'd simply stopped being taken advantage of. Most relatives grew quiet when they heard the full story. A few tried to defend my father and sister, suggesting that maybe they'd meant their comments differently or that I'd overreacted. But several others admitted they'd suspected something like this was happening, that my father had always been quick to expect others to solve his financial problems. 2 weeks before the house closing, my sister made one final attempt. She appeared at my apartment complex, somehow having discovered my new address. This time, her approach was completely different. My sister looked genuinely remorseful when I answered the door. She apologized for everything, the comments I'd overheard, the years of taking my support for granted, the way they'd treated me during the confrontations. She admitted they'd been wrong and selfish. She explained that they'd found a small apartment they could afford with my father's Social Security and her part-time income. She said they'd learned to budget properly for the first time in years. She asked if there was any way we could rebuild our relationship, not for money, but as family. Her apology felt genuine, but I'd had weeks to think about our history. The pattern went back much further than 3 years. Growing up, I'd been the responsible one while she'd been the favorite who could do no wrong. My academic achievements were expected, her mediocre efforts were celebrated. My financial success as an adult had simply become another resource for them to exploit. I told my sister that forgiveness was possible, but rebuilding trust would take time and consistent change behavior. I explained that I needed space to figure out who I was when I wasn't constantly managing their financial crises. She nodded sadly and asked if I'd at least stay in touch occasionally. I agreed to that much. The house closed on schedule. My father and sister moved into their small apartment the same week. I heard from cousins that the adjustment was difficult, but that they were managing. 3 months later, I received a handwritten letter from my father. His penmanship looked shaky, older than I remembered. He apologized for everything, the comments about me, the years of expecting financial support, the way he'd raised me to feel responsible for everyone else's problems. My father wrote that living within their actual means had taught him how much I'd been covering. He said he'd never fully understood the scope of my support until it was gone. He thanked me for everything I'd done, even though he'd never thanked me when it mattered. The letter ended with a request to see me sometime, not for money or help, just to talk. He wrote that he understood if I wasn't ready for that, but hoped someday I might be. I kept the letter but didn't respond immediately. 6 months after the house sale, I ran into my sister at a grocery store. She looked different, tired but somehow more grounded. She was checking prices carefully, using coupons, clearly living on a tight budget. My sister approached me cautiously, asking how I'd been. We talked briefly about work and weather before she mentioned that she'd gotten a second job to help with expenses. She said the adjustment had been hard, but that they were learning to appreciate what they had. She didn't ask for money or help. She didn't mention our family situation or try to guilt me into anything. She simply said she hoped I was doing well and that she understood why I'd done what I did. A year later, my father's health declined significantly. My sister called to let me know he'd been hospitalized with heart problems. She was quick to clarify that she wasn't asking for financial help. They had insurance and were managing the costs. She just thought I should know. I visited him in the hospital. He looked frail, much older than his actual age. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. He thanked me for coming and apologized again for everything that had happened between us. My father told me that the heart attack had given him perspective on what really mattered. He said he was proud of the man I'd become, even though he'd failed to show it properly. He asked if there was any chance we could have some kind of relationship moving forward. I stayed for an hour, talking about safer topics, his treatment, the weather, neutral family news. When I left, I told him I'd visit again soon. Over the following months, I began having occasional dinners with them. The dynamic was completely different now. They paid for their own meals, never hinted at financial problems, and treated me like a son rather than a resource. My sister had matured considerably during their year of independence. She'd learned skills she'd never needed before: budgeting, meal planning, home maintenance. She seemed more confident and self-sufficient than I'd ever seen her. My father remained apologetic and grateful for any time I spent with them. He'd ask about my life, my work, my interests, questions he'd never bothered with before. He seemed genuinely interested in my answers rather than just waiting for opportunities to mention his own needs. The relationship we built wasn't the same as before, and it never would be. Too much had happened. Too many years of taking advantage had created permanent changes. But it was honest in a way our previous dynamic had never been. Looking back, I realized that selling the house and cutting off their financial support was the kindest thing I could have done for all of us. It forced them to develop independence and self-respect they'd never needed before. It taught me that enabling bad behavior isn't the same as helping family. I never did find out if they ever took that Costa Rica trip. Somehow, I doubt they missed it as much as they thought they would. The experience taught me that real family relationships require mutual respect and genuine care, not just financial obligation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be taken advantage of, even when it's difficult for everyone involved. I still help family when there are genuine emergencies, but now it's a choice rather than an expectation. The difference has made all our relationships healthier and more honest. My father passed away 2 years later. In his final weeks, he told me repeatedly how proud he was of me and how sorry he was for the years he'd wasted seeing me as a solution to his problems rather than as his son. Those conversations meant more to me than all the money I'd ever given them. My sister and I maintain a cordial relationship. She's built a stable life for herself and learned to take pride in her independence. We'll never be close the way some siblings are, but there's mutual respect now that wasn't there before. Sometimes people ask if I regret how harshly I handled the situation. The answer is no. Boundaries aren't cruel when they're necessary, and sometimes shock treatment is the only thing that creates lasting change. I learned that being family doesn't mean accepting disrespect or exploitation. Real love sometimes requires difficult choices that serve everyone's long-term best interests, even when they hurt in the moment. The house sold for enough money that I was able to make a substantial down payment on my own place. Living independently, without the constant financial drain of supporting ungrateful family members, allowed me to build real wealth for the first time. More importantly, I learned to value myself appropriately. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could give others and started expecting the same respect and consideration I'd always given freely. That overheard conversation was devastating at the time, but it gave me information I needed to make healthy changes. Sometimes the most painful truths are also the most liberating ones.